fuel into a raging fire right next to the building trusses. This building 7 was built over an old Con Ed station, and so there were 2 or 3 trusses that held it, and the fire was right next to it. Now, a conspiracist will say endlessly that the fires, couldn't burn out these huge steel structural supports, but they can certainly compromise it so they bend, and this fire finally caused it to come down. It's always quoted then that they say the owner of Building 7 said later, let's pull it. And they say, surely this is an admission of deliberate sabotage, which seems to me ludicrous. Why would he admit this publicly if he'd done it for the insurance? Actually, I think he was saying, he'd said, let's pull the fire crews out of it. But it's all there in Manuel's pieces. And I thank you for a very rational voice when you bring up these issues.
Washington, D.C.
Good day. How are you? I'm very critical of you, Mr. Cockburn. I've read your site diligently for 5 years when you first started. And I think the basis of what I'm saying is liberalism, conservatism is a diversionary argument. We need the politics of realism where what's being voted on, the direct facts of what's being voted on is the discussion, not name-calling or slinging things. And if the politics of war and peace and the diversions going on, if you're talking about Waco, that was a diversion for a missile launch at Thompson No. 7, April 7th. You're talking about the Bronco chase. That's General Kagame coming from Leavenworth, Kansas, an army base there, to invade into eastern Congo with 5 million people killed. If you're talking about Iraq, you're talking about 4 million people killed since Cheney said this war is about oil in 1990 and holding down a third of the oil production in the world and keeping the costs up. That's the real effect. In 40 years of war in Afghanistan, there's a big Brzezinski laughs about how we tricked everybody into this. And if you talk about Israel, it's a diversion. When George Walker Bush, his first day in office, shut down the peace liaison office set up for CIA between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government, worked very well in Ireland, and the 96 Oslo Accords was set forward. And this is when Secretary of State Powell said, wait a minute, this is when he was put in the freezer, as his own words, and told to be quiet. This is used as a diversion, and if we talk about...
Caller, I'm going to leave it at that. Diversions.
Well, I'm not quite... diversion. I mean, the caller mentioned, well, I think maybe 7 or 8 episodes, and says they're all diversions. I mean, some of them, the things he mentioned were significant episodes. Some of them I didn't even understand about, something to do with Kagame, and I don't know, I didn't quite get what the connections were. It seemed to me to say that always that, like Waco is a diversion. I don't think Waco is a diversion. I mean, Waco was something, just to stay with Waco because he started with that, I don't want to, like, you said so many, caller, that I couldn't quite keep up with them, frankly. But I think, was it a diversion? No, I think the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, I don't think people said, now we need a diversion to change the subject from whatever infamous deed we're really up to, and we need everybody suddenly to start thinking about, Waco, the same way now, I mean, is the thing that everyone in America is thinking right now is, did they buy the wrong pet food last week? And is this a diversion from the Attorney General scandal? People are diverted from thinking about the rather brief future of the Attorney General Gonzalez, but meanwhile they're wondering whether they bought the wrong kibble for their old hound. Now, some people say this is all a diversion from something, but it's still a fact that apparently all the dog food in the entire world is made by one company in Ontario, Canada, which is all very interesting. And I hope there might be hearings on dog food coming up soon, which people will be watching like anything. So to say that things are diversions, very often people say that, like Lewinsky Gate was a diversion. Well, it's something that happened at the same time something else happened. I think people do try and do diversions. I mean, to take an example which was really serious, when the Rwanda genocide was going on, the Clinton people said, we don't want to have diversion from people concentrating on our onslaughts on what was then Yugoslavia. That was people do diversions. Like they say, look at this, so they won't look at this. But I think the caller, and again, it's a little unfair because it was a long list and I couldn't really keep up with it. I don't think they're all diversions. They're things that happened. And to see it always as a pattern. I think people oversee things as a carefully considered pattern. Like, you suddenly say, look at this pattern of events. It was all the Freemasons. There's a strain in I think the American imagination, in every imagination, that establishes patterns beyond what the evidence will permit.
This book, 1995, Washington, Babylon.
Another great book.
Which one sold the most, by the way? Do you know?
Oh, down the years, I think probably Corruptions of Empire, which was the first collection I did.
1987.
Yeah, that was a very popular book. Then I think actually
20 years ago.
20 years ago, I know. Every word still as vital and as peppy as it ever was. And then Whiteout, I think, was is a consistent seller still. There are some books that didn't sell so good. I did a book on chess once, which I can see nestling down there.
Yes, I was going to bring that up when the caller earlier asked about chess.
Oh, yeah, chess. Well, I did that when I was at the Village Voice. I had to do Village Voice books. In fact, it was one of the reasons I was hired. But of course, the idea was that we get all the Village Voice writers, like the late Jack Newfield and various people like that, and then I would sign them up. But of course, all these people were signed up by mucky muck publishers already, so I had to do one myself, and it was the Fischer-Spassky match was going on, and I wrote a piece, and I turned it into an attack on chess. I mean, the pretensions of chess, that if you're a good chess player, you've got a mind like Einstein, a political instincts like, the mayor of Boston in 1920 or whatever it was. And it's actually got a very good class history of chess. There's a lot of other bogus Freudian stuff in there too. But it didn't sell well because the booksellers didn't know whether to put it in the sports section or the psychological section or the political science section. So I think it was kind of a dud, although it got very good reviews, actually. Very good reviews.
Back to Washington, Babylon. What were you trying to do with this book?
Washington, Babylon was done to really look at. Actually, of course, the title takes off from Kenneth Anger's book, Hollywood Babylon, a book of great gossip, one of the greatest gossip books ever written. Wonderful book. And that's why we called it Washington Babylon. And it was also a little in the tradition of, there were kind of a series of books called like Washington Confidential that people used to do in the very old days. In fact, my dad was a co-writer of one in the 30s. He was here for the London Times as assistant correspondent in the late 20s. Here in the United States, and he was in New York for the crash, and he was in Washington later, and then he went to Chicago and interviewed Capone and the like of it. So these were kind of an inside Washington book. And so we do the media elites, we do the Pentagon, we do this and that and the other thing in that book.
Here's a couple of what you said. This is Charlie Peters. People who watch C-SPAN know him as the former head of the Washington Monthly. And you say that the Washington Monthly has given enormous pleasure to Babylon's elites with the safe essays on neoliberalism iconoclasm.
Yeah, well, in the late 70s on, Washington Monthly, done indeed by Charlie Peters, they had a specialty of seemingly daring challenging of received knowledge. And, they had capable writers at that game. I think, like, I don't know if Jim Fallows wrote for them at that point. And
he was one of Charlie. Yes, he was one of Mr.
And there was that whole generation of, they were kind of in a way, I don't know what you'd call them, but they really were sort of mainstream liberals who were fearlessly challenging, they seemed to be fearlessly challenging received wisdom, but actually really what it was a cutting down of, or a final onslaught on kind of the idea of left ideas, that they were neoliberals in the sense that they generally said, efforts at regulation of, exercising popular power, that's what the logic of it was, were futile and full of hypocrisy and pretension. A lot of them were attacks on, the old Roosevelt programs, many of which were like desperate attempts to try and fend off something to the left of FDR. There's something else, Everyone says, FDR, the old left Democratic Party. I mean, a lot of the New Deal was attempts to head off something much more serious in terms of, popular upsurge. The Wagner Act came about because people thought, there were millions and millions of people, workers, and people who needed work who were really going to overthrow the system. So you had to throw something and give them a sop of bread. But meanwhile, now, Roosevelt and the New Deal have been positioned by the untiring efforts of people like the late Arthur Schlesinger and others as, the sort of high benchmark, high watermark of radical possibility in this country. Absolutely not true at all. And so these Washington Monthly writers, many of whom went on and sort of, ended up in the sort of the Democratic Leadership Council or writing for The Atlantic or whoever, are part and parcel of this whole onslaught on the idea of anything particularly radical happening in the United States.
Here's a picture of Lally Weymouth of the Washington Post, and you wrote about her, the blinding inaccuracy of her perceptions, tantrums, and incessant rudeness.
Oh, I don't know. Let's pass on that one.
You're not going to take that on?
No.
How about Newt Gingrich? You say about Newt Gingrich, he's one of the great welfare cheats of all time.
Yeah, I think, oh yeah, because I think when he was in Georgia, I think he was constantly, as usual with every congressman, log rolling for his district. I've forgotten what the specific charges were. Mercifully, at one point Gingrich was up there, in the radical pantheon as one of the great menaces of all time. I think it's a sort of lesson for the progressive forces that very often you look at Republicans, who come in like Gingrich, and they have an agenda, which is fine. That's what you should have. And then they really push for it. And then they go on and on and on. And finally, either they get nailed, and go down like Gingrich did, or, they keep on slugging. Whereas very often, on the liberal end, they have a quarter of an agenda, and by the time they get into office, they've already forgotten it.
We're taking a look at another former speaker, Tom Foley, you have in this book, and you say that his name will endure wherever grizzlies and salmon die, or where radioactivity enhances nature's temple.
Oh, yeah, well, that was because Tom Foley was, of course, from Eastern Washington. And, if you're a politician from Eastern Washington, by and large, though not totally, I should hasten to say, because I have friends who are politicians from Eastern Washington whom I admire, you're going to intervene on part of the, let's say, the Hanford nuclear reservation up there. That was the crack about the nuclear power. And, the politics of the Columbia River have always been basically to, until, there's some good books on that, but, to make it impossible for salmon to survive in any, possible form, unless the poor salmon have to try and climb up 200 ladders, 83 dams, get mashed up in boiling nuclear waste, and come out the other end as some kind of mutant. That's the salmon for you. And I think we said the grizzlies. Well, again, the politics of the grizzly, as exercised by a Western senator or a Western congressman, are not good for the grizzly. The grizzly is a beleaguered creature. Anyone who doubts that can read Doug Peacock's wonderful books on grizzlies. There's an incredible fraud, that they're always exercising to do with grizzlies and with wolves, which you've written about endlessly. Well, actually, my co-editor, Jeffrey Sinclair, has written wonderfully on this issue, and the buffalo, and what's actually being done to exterminate these species.
Let's get back to some phone calls for you. Next is Los Angeles.
Hello, C-SPAN. I haven't called in over 30 days, and I'd like to not get cut off, and I'd like some follow-ups like the pro-Israel callers had earlier here. Thank you for having Alexander Cockburn on the broadcast. Mr. Cockburn, I wanted to address a couple issues from your website and also in various books that are out that just aren't getting addressed to the extent that they should be in the pro-Israel press and media here in the States. First of all, you had an excellent writer, Stephen Green, who had written the Serving Two Frags piece for Counterpunch. He'd written some earlier books as well about the pro-Israel lobby and individuals associated with it, like Richard Pearl, who's part of or associated with the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA. And if you recall Washington Post editor Karen DeYoung's new bio book about Colin Powell, you can look up JINSA in the index of it, and it conveys that the JINSA crowd, at least Colin Powell has conveyed this recently, I might add, for that book, that the JINSA crowd is in control of the Pentagon. So here we have Stephen Green, who was actually brought in as a consultant for the AIPAC case. If you read the back of the paperback version of James Bamford's A Pretext for War book, which conveys that we went to war for Israel and Iraq, and that we were attacked on 9/11 tragically because of U.S. support for what Israel does to brutally oppress the Palestinian people. Mr. Green was brought in as a consultant on this AIPAC case, and we don't see anything in the U.S. media about it. It's incredible. You can also, when I had the call for President Carter in an earlier broadcast of In Depth here, Ms. Doebele had said that Paul Finley, the esteemed Republican